Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The State of Women in Poverty, Centering in Intersectional Narratives and Implications for the Future. I am Tiffany Marley, Vice President for Practice Transformation here at the Partnership, and we are just so glad that you have joined us for today's presentation. It is a continuation of a presentation that started at the Partnership's Equity Summit that was held earlier in the spring. And as we kick off today's presentation, just want to invite everyone to ground ourselves in some important concepts. One being the acknowledgement of the land on which we sit here today. Everyone, every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life. And some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to interrupting trauma and beginning the journey of healing and resilience. So we begin today's webinar by acknowledging what has been buried, honoring the truth, and embracing a new future, especially for our children, and most of all for women around the world who give birth to children. And so with that said, I would like to acknowledge that today's webinar is being held on the traditional lands of the Lumbee people. So I'm in North Carolina, and I pay my respect to elders, both past and present, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. I also invite my colleagues to put in the chat, maybe they've done so already, the link to land acknowledgement, whereby you can just go to the left corner. Once you click on that link, put in your zip code, and it'll tell you whose lands you currently sit. And then we invite you to just name the names to acknowledge the people on whose land you sit or stand today, or you can write your own statement of acknowledgement. Again, most of all, we want to welcome you and thank you for joining today's presentation. The other important thing that we would like to ground everyone in today is the promise of community action itself. That promise asserts that community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. And so as we engage in this time of learning and conversation today, may both of these expressions, which I have offered, really fuel us. And with that said, just want to start by saying this, just as an intro, before introducing our speakers. The alarming rates of women who live in poverty in America is a recurring trend that has deep historic and systemic roots. With more US women living in poverty than men, the COVID-19 pandemic has not only put the economic security of women at risk, it has put families at increased risk of falling into poverty and remaining there. And as we think about this whole notion that our current administration has put forth around building back better, as we think about the connecting the dots, picking up the pieces as a result of or in response to this pandemic, we must be mindful of just the critical voice and value that women bring, and that intersectional aspect of that, that in some cases has marginalized, but we want to use that word intersectional in a way that really creates a path to opportunity, such that as we think about ways that we can build back better to create opportunities, that we ensure that we're doing so for all people, for all persons. And so we are grateful for our panelists, our experts who have come together with us today to share their perspectives on implications and opportunities for families, health, and well-being, and their insights on the new economy, the new possibilities that might be imagined using the equity lens. And so with that said, I am going to start by introducing our first panelist, our presenter today, our first presenter, Dr. Candace Creel Falcone. Her pronouns are she, they, their, and she is an interdisciplinary feminist scholar, writer, and visual artist. Their life's passion grounds the power of narrative for social transformation. Born in Kansas and raised in New Mexico, they moved to Minnesota in 2004 to pursue their doctoral degree in feminist studies at the University of Minnesota. After nearly 2 decades in higher education teaching women's and gender studies and ethnic studies, she began making art. They are a gifted artist. I'm drawn to multidisciplinary approaches, bringing together painting, printmaking, fabric arts, and writing. Dr. Falcone strives to make sense of the world around them for positive social change. While not making art, she consults with corporate leadership, public leaders, and nonprofit organization staff on gender and racial equity. And so at this time, I would like to invite Dr. Falcone to share some words with us, and we will proceed from there. So Dr. Falcone, we'll open it up to you to get us started in our conversation today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Tiffany. And thank you everyone for inviting us back to be able to share our prepared remarks that we had originally prepped for the Equity Summit. You can see on my slides here, that was all the way back in April. And Tiffany and I were just chatting about how that feels like that was 5 years ago. And that could not be a more true statement for me. So, as Tiffany shared, I'm Dr. Candace Creel Falcone, and I'm zooming in from the traditional homelands of the Oceti-Sakowin, specifically the Mdewakanton Dakota people, and I honor the past, present, and future caretaking of the lands in which I live in rural Otter Tail County, Minnesota. So I'm happy to be here to discuss gender equity. As a feminist scholar, going to get a degree in feminist studies, it's a dream to be able to speak with people and think about how do you operationalize feminist theory for more expansive worlds that create the equity that we're really trying to achieve together. And so before I dive in, I did want to just talk a little bit about these terms that I'm going to be using throughout the presentation. So I use Bell Hook's definition of feminism as a movement to end sexism and other forms of oppression. And really that definition of feminism means that feminism is for everybody. And we all have a part in doing the work in dismantling these systemic structures that oppress, and that if we end sexism and other forms of oppression, we will all be free. I also think about equity as a verb and a process that's about realigning systems for reparative and restorative redistribution of resources to those most marginalized. And I like that definition of equity because it means that we have to be taking some action, right? That I think all of us have been really keyed into the ways that we're having some very important public discourse around equity as a framework. And I think we really need to remember that equity is different from diversity, equity is different from inclusion, that it has its own role in this work of feminism. And then, of course, we're talking about gender equity today, which means that we're thinking about how do we repair and redistribute resources that to the most marginalized. And in this context of gender equity, the most marginalized under the systems of patriarchy are women and transgender folks, right? So we're thinking about gender expansively, not just in the gender binary context, but also in terms of diverse gender identities and the impacts of those systems that they might have on people wherever they are. And of course, this involves men too. Men are also impacted by how patriarchy shapes our notions of the world around us. So I wanted to really provide a framework for us to think differently about this notion of the state of women in poverty. And I'm going to use some of my lecturing skills and my feminist theory background and give you a framework to think about for your own work, possibly in your organizations. So the quote in front of you here is from a feminist theorist, Joan Tronto. And the quote says, "The world will look different if we move care from its current peripheral location to a place near the center of human life." So I really want to spend some time talking about the word care and using Joan Tronto's framework to help us better understand the narrative potential of both understanding how care might be operating in the current structures of, patriarchy that upholds compulsory heterosexuality, sexism, and homophobia, and a way that we might shift to a different understanding of care that might be able to be embedded in the work that we do. So I'm really interested in this notion of care because back in April, you might recall, we, for the first time in my lifetime, I started hearing people in the federal policy realms talking about care as infrastructure, right? Talking about care as like an important part of the world around us that helps our world function in a way that was really kind of revolutionary in a sense, right? It was going back to a very feminist understanding of care. And as Tiffany mentioned, we are seeing the results of the COVID-19 pandemic that has hit women harder than men. And so we have an inequity in the experience of the impact of this pandemic that has been on the shoulders of women more than men. Although obviously lots of people have been affected personally and economically by this crisis. So if you think about industries like the restaurant industry, hospitality, and healthcare, these are women-concentrated industries where women primarily overrepresent the jobs in those sectors. And those are areas that have been particularly impacted by our COVID-19 pandemic. And then research shows that 40% of working women are in government, health, and education workforces. So that's another way that you might start thinking about that disparate impact that the pandemic has been having on women. So I just wanted to share that to kind of ground us as a valuable opportunity for us to think about the work of community action through a feminist framework using this care concept. So, let's see if I can get there. Great. So if we think about care as infrastructure, I'm really excited to think about like how care is coming into the conversation and the narrative possibilities of thinking about care differently. So Bernice Fisher and Joan Tronto define care as a species activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. I'm going to read that again for you all. Bernice Fisher and Joan Tronto define care as a species activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. So if we think about care in this way, care is a practice. So it can function between how we as humans interact with the environments or geography in which we live. It's multi-directional, meaning that it goes multiple ways between people and the environment, people to people, right? If you think about like teaching as a caring practice, the teacher provides information to students, but students also teach the professor, right? That there's a reciprocality in that work if you choose to approach it in that way. And then care can be a single activity, like, you know, making a meal for a loved one, or it can describe a process of, you know, care as like a grounding purpose or value of the work that you do. So think about like social workers. The oath of social workers, right, is that you are connected to a deep sense of caring about communities that describes a process through which you're connected. And of course, care is always culturally constructed. So different cultures have different understandings around what care looks like and how that manifests in family relationships and the relationship between yourself and your work, etc. I'd also say that care also suggests that if we think about it as a practice, that we might be coming to some shared agreements about how we might adhere to these ideas of caring for one another and our environment together. And then if we think about care as a practice, we also have to think about care as an action, right? Practice is not just something that you like read about and put away. It's like ongoing, right? If you think about like a yoga practice, you show up every day. There's an element of discipline. Other things that you do as a practice, like a journaling practice, right? It's about repetition, coming back, reflection, learning. And really, it's about action. So you can care about something in like a theoretical sense, like, oh yeah, I care about climate change. But if we're only saying we care about it and not doing anything to really address the systems in which climate change continues to manifest in harmful ways for particular groups, do we truly care about it? So these are some hard questions for us to think about, right? And I'm giving them to you all to kind of chew on and mull over, like what is your care practice and how does that manifest in your workplace? So there's there's four main phases that Joan Tronto uses to kind of explain this framework of care as a practice. And I'm just gonna like quickly go through them, but there's some ideas for you to think about how this might happen in your own work. So the first phase is about caring about, and this is kind of like a great parallel to like organizing, right? That you have to have some kind of shared understanding and agreement about something before you can make any change related to that, right? It's this educational phase, it's a deeper understanding so that you can make an assessment about how a particular need might need to be met. So today we're talking about how do we care about gender inequities, right? How do we care about this issue that women are disproportionately affected by COVID-19 pandemic? So how are we caring about paid family leave? And we can think about this as like from a group, a federal standpoint, a national standpoint, or locally in our communities, or down to the actual infrastructure of your community action partnership and the counties you serve. How are you caring about the gender pay gap, right? It's one thing to say like, yes, we care about gender inequities, but part of the gender inequities are exacerbated by COVID because women aren't paid the same for work that men are being paid for. So, and that there are disparities within particular jobs, and there's disparities across how we pay for particular kinds of work that women often get tracked into. How are we caring about violence against transgender people, right? Transgender women of color are directly impacted more than any other group of women for targeted violence that often results in their death. And so how are we caring about that? How are we caring about women's jobs losses in this context of the COVID-19 pandemic? How are we caring about access to affordable childcare? You know, one of the tenets of this challenge that we have around women and poverty is that childcare like expense, right, is too much for families to handle. And so often that requires maybe women to leave the workforce to care for children. Or on the other hand, only particular women are given the cultural space to take time away from work to care for their children, right? We have inequities in terms of who's able to afford childcare and who's able to even care for their children in the way that they want to care for them, which is also culturally related. How are we caring about Black women's maternal mortality rates, right? These are major systemic issues that we can look at and kind of see how they intersect with the COVID-19 pandemic and also our oppressive economic systems. Black women are, I think, 4 times as likely to die in childbirth as white women. And that is a systemic issue, and it shouldn't be happening in the so-called, industrialized nation. The United States has terrible numbers on this compared to other nations. How are we caring about sexual violence and the disparate impacts that that has on communities, on children, on Indigenous communities? How are we caring about reproductive justice? How are we integrating reproductive justice into our work to help alleviate the economic burdens that women have when they can't take ownership over family planning? How are we caring about murdered and missing Indigenous women, right? How are we caring about educational opportunity gaps? And as you can kind of see as these issues emerge, all issues are women's issues, right? This is a feminist framework from second wave feminism that like every political issue is a women's issue. When you get down to the brass tacks, there's a gendered component to all of the ways that we organize our society. So another way of thinking about this care as a practice would be how we take care of. And so after you identify what you're caring about as an organization or as a group of people, taking care of relies on the fact that we have a responsibility to determine how to meet that need. So instead of focusing on the needs of the other person alone, taking care of asks us to initiate action to address the unmet social need that is happening. And again, this like is such a beautiful feminist thing to think about in terms of how you approach these major issues that I just talked about, because it's not about being like the good savior of someone else, right? Taking care of is really an act of generosity and a reciprocal relationship you have with the people who are most directly affected by the issue that you're caring about. So how are we taking care of, so just some more food for thought for you all, those who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, right? How are we thinking about community action partnership avenues to support folks coming from that particular experience? How are we taking care of people experiencing homelessness? Are we, approaching it from an idea of we have the funds, we have the ideas, we have the knowledge, we have the power to provide housing for people? Or are we really in a reciprocal taking care of relationship with people experiencing homelessness? How are we taking care of undocumented community members, right? I know this is really a tricky subject around federal funding and the whims of different attitudes related to folks in our communities, but undocumented people are in our communities, and they deserve and like should have access to the same amount of care as anybody else, given how they are integrated into, again, the systems that help make our world go round. How are we taking care of those targeted by hate crimes, right? This is another gendered dimension. I think Sung Yeon might talk a little bit about this. I know she mentioned it last time we met, around the increased violence against Asian women, right? Asian American women, and especially in the COVID-19 context. And we have these historic waves in which undocumented people are attacked and targeted, or immigrant workers, or queer LGBT folk, right? Trans folk. So Jewish people, how are we taking care of those who are targeted by hate crimes, those who are hungry, those disproportionately who are experiencing police brutality? How are we taking care of sex workers, right? We have people in our communities that are taking part in informal economies to live. And sometimes these are the only economies that they have access to feed their families. So how are we creating conditions in which they can come to community action without shame, without judgment, and get the same services that anybody else might be able to receive? People's reproductive rights, etc. So, oops, sorry, those are my notes. Phases 3 and 4 involve the recognizing of the dimensions of caregiving, as not just about the care that we give, but also the receiving of care. And again, this is just like a more holistic way of approaching this notion of care, so that we're not only just providing care, right? There has to be a level of consent and desire for that care to be given, right? We've all been smothered by someone, I'm sure. And that kind of care is like really hard, right? Because you're not asking for that kind of care. And so care giving and care receiving are on two ends of a spectrum that need to be, we need to remember that the people receiving care need to be asking for that, right? And wanting that. So lastly, to finish up, I'll just say that we're in a crisis of care, and there's a possibility for us to really reclaim this idea of care and really revalue care as work, and revalue those who have typically and traditionally been assigned the value, the work and labor of care in our society, right? Care has been gendered, raced, and classed in particular ways. And it's up for us to like make sense of this and then dismantle the systems that keep that in place, that prevents some people from having more avenues to care. And if we think about care and believe it to be infrastructure, then we all have to hold a piece of this work. So I'll stop there and let Sung Yeon share what she'd like to share. And then again, we have some time for questions. If people would like to pop those in the chat, we'll come back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Falcone. Just very provocative insights that you put out on the table around this whole notion of gender and care. And we look forward to some additional discussion about that. Before we do so, though, it is our pleasure to introduce our next expert, the Reverend Songyong Choimoro. Reverend Choimoro is a first-generation immigrant working mom who is passionate about building power to create change so her daughter can live in a more just world than the one she inherited. She is the executive director of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. It is a national organization with the vision of building power with Asian American and Pacific Islander women and girls to create a more equitable society for AAPI women and girls and other women of color. Reverend Choimoro was born in South Korea and spent her childhood in Singapore and India. Songyong came to the US at the age of 18 to study political science and urban studies at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. She has made Chicagoland her home since. She is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. Reverend Choimoro, we thank you again for being with us today and welcome your insights and wisdom in this conversation today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's so good to be back with you all. I know that the last time we were all together in April was quite a watershed moment for our country, and I really appreciated everyone being flexible and holding space as we needed to, and then now joining us again months later, which feels like a while. It's been quite a busy summer for many of us. So thank you for tuning in again and coming back to learn about, especially in my case, about the Asian American community, and especially how poverty impacts women and families. I just first want to start off by acknowledging that I work and live on Potawatomi land here in the Chicagoland area. And thank you to everybody who have shared about where they are zooming in from today. So just a little bit about Napoth, just to kick us off, and then I do want to do some overview. We are a national advocacy organization, as well as research and leadership development organization that works with Asian American Pacific Islander women and girls. Our focus is to work on public policy that will help improve lives of Asian American Pacific Islander women and girls and family. And we do this with a reproductive justice framework, which is a word Dr. Falcon mentioned earlier. But with the reproductive justice framework, what that means is that we believe that every person should have the right and ability to make decisions, whether they want to have a child, when to have a child, and the conditions in which we raise the children that we have, right? It is a holistic approach where a person's ability to choose how we want to create families and raise the families that we have is at the center of how we think about justice. And so for us, it's not just about working on reproductive health access or rights, but it's about what are all the conditions that allows a person, in our case, especially women and girls, to thrive. And so every day we're working away at that question of how do we make sure that Asian American Pacific Islander women and girls have more agency, have full agency over themselves, their own bodies, their families, and their communities, so that we can thrive and not just survive. So that's our big audacious goal here at Napoth. And we do that through public policy advocacy, through research, and through organizing in our community, so that the women that are most impacted by the issues that we work on are at the forefront of helping us fight for our access and affordability for to be able to live. Often we think about and talk about our work in the context of not just rights, but access, because you can have rights and still not be able to afford it. You could have rights to healthcare, but that doesn't mean you have the means to be able to afford healthcare that you and your family need. And so that's the frame in which we work from. And, I think Dr. Falcon did it's a great preview or a context setting for what I'm going to talk about in terms of thinking about our work in a care framework and just the nuances that Dr. Falcon provided there. I'm really appreciative of. My talk is going to be slightly different in that it's really going to be more about the state of Asian American Pacific Islander women and girls in our country. And I apologize if some of you or many of you are familiar with our community and the intersecting issues that impact especially Asian American Pacific Islander women and girls. But I'm here to give a little bit of an overview, and I'm happy to answer more questions, but also I can put in at the end of my talk a link to where some of my research or some of the statistics that I will be talking about, which are really research that Napoth we do on our own, comes from. So just to start off, overall, we Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders come from about 50 countries of origin. We speak over 100 languages and dialects in the United States, and we make up about 23 million people in the population right now. By 2065, Pew Research Center projects that Asian American Pacific Islanders will make up the largest racial group at 38% of the United States population. And the next largest group will be Hispanics at 31% of our population. So Asian American, the AAPI population is on the rise and will be growing significantly. And there are many of you may work in cities where it's visible the number of Asian Americans and the communities that are growing in your city or metropolitan area. For example, Atlanta, Houston, Dallas area. These are areas that the Asian American population is exploding. Of the 23 million Asian American Pacific Islanders, 14% of us are undocumented. Again, this is a little known fact about our community, but we do have undocumented community members. And in the Korean American community, 1 in 5 Korean Americans are undocumented. 10% of our population live in poverty. And it really is, and I'll talk a little bit more about this and you'll pick it up as a theme, but one of the challenges about the statistics about Asian American community is that we get aggregated into a number that cannot be disaggregated. So our community is not oversampled in research. And so we cannot disaggregate the data by ethnic groups. And the Asian American community is one of the most diverse communities in terms of cultural background, language, as well as socioeconomic and also educational attainment. And so when you lump all of us in a small sample and come up with an average, it really does skew the numbers for specific communities. And what we find is that those that live in poverty, that have some of the more some of the more significant disparities in the communities kind of get overlooked because our data gets aggregated. So for example, even though there are 10% of our population live in poverty, Mongolian Americans, there are 25% of Mongolian Americans live in poverty. That's a huge difference from 10%. And yet, because our data doesn't often get disaggregated, most people don't know about that. And so that is an important thing to note, that if you do research, collect data, or are looking to collect data or using data that's collected about the Asian American community, it is important that you find disaggregated data as much as possible. Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders are 59% of us are homeowners versus the 64% of the national average. We also, work in all sectors, but as I'm going to be talking a little bit about COVID related conditions for the API community right now, I just want to also mention that, Asian American Pacific Islander women overall only make up 2.9% of the overall workforce, yet we are overrepresented in the frontline sector. There are 3.8% of Asian American Pacific Islander women who are in frontline work, and 66% of Asian American Pacific Islander women workers do not have access to paid sick leave or paid sick days, and 48% of non-citizen Asian American Pacific Islanders lack health insurance. So as you can imagine, even pre-COVID, these are conditions that set up for immigrant women especially to really struggle, right? Making low wages, minimum wage, or hourly wages, and lacking healthcare, access to healthcare. During COVID, one of the one of the data that came out earlier this year around February in studying last year's unemployment trends was that unemployed Asian American Pacific Islander women have the longest term, highest rates of long-term unemployment compared to all other racial groups. So 44% of Asian American Pacific Islander women who are unemployed have been unemployed for longer than 6 months. And you know, when that statistic came out, I got a lot of calls from reporters and people wanting to know more about the data. And what people didn't realize is how many Asian American women do work in service sector. And as I'm talking, you know, I'm like, well, they're the ones that serve you the food when you go eat at a Chinese restaurant or a Korean restaurant or Indian restaurant. They're the ones who do your nails, your hair. I mean, and run, you know, our cashiers at grocery stores. I mean, Asian American Pacific Islander women are not only lawyers and engineers as our stereotype might hold, but we do work in service sectors as well. And people completely forgot or didn't realize that. And so it is not surprising that so many women, so many Asian American Pacific Islander women have been unemployed for so long because one, you know, many things were shut down, but also because they lack access to healthcare, they don't want to risk going into work in fear of catching COVID when they don't have healthcare, right? Access to affordable healthcare. And so these are so as you know, as we talk about intersecting issues that you know, leave people in poverty. I mean, COVID is a great example of what's happening in our country, not just for Asian American Pacific Islander women and girls, but in our case, it is showing how Asian American Pacific Islander women and girls have also been left behind in our economy, as well as in access to healthcare that could really help many of us get back on our feet. Another reason for many women being unemployed and another major factor, especially during COVID, as we think about economic opportunities and why people are not returning to work, there are two things I want to mention here. One is that, as you may have seen in the news by now, but Asian American Pacific Islanders have been targeted for racial targets of racial violence, whether it's racial slurs or physical intimidation because of COVID-related stereotypes, right? I mean, I personally have experienced that myself of people, you know, yelling at me to go back to China or taking my virus back home. I mean, this is a very commonly experienced, unfortunately, encounter when people who look like me go out on the streets every day. And we know, you know, not recently, but as this has culminated, it has turned violent, right? And so we have seen the news articles of elderly women being battered, and even some folks ending up dead because of the violence they experience on the street, that, you know, can be tied to stereotypes and fear that has been created by our former president and the silence of our public, our communities, frankly, that has allowed this perpetuation of fear of Asian Americans in public and scapegoating of our communities for the virus. 68% of all of the incidents that have been reported by Asian Americans about racial hate and violence have been reported by women. Women are more likely to be harassed in public by people we don't know, right? There are lots of different forms of harassment and discrimination that we're experiencing. For example, housing discrimination is on the rise right now. People don't want to lease and rent to Asian American renters. There are ways of being discriminated at work or people shunning, but the more violent, active, aggressive interactions that happen in public, women are twice as likely to experience that than men. And so, you know, it could be for safety reasons that people are not wanting to go to work, right? So at our organization, we have been fortunate enough that most of us have been able to work from home. All of us actually have been able to work from home, and we're sort of slowly phasing in. But at the beginning, I remember last March, we didn't know how long we were going to be in this. And we did a survey of the staff and of some of our members just about like, what do they think about going back in the summer. And more people were afraid or concerned about the street harassment they would experience commuting to work than they were about catching the virus, right? I mean, this is back before we knew anything about the vaccine and the like. And so that really tells you something, right? That people are more afraid of experiencing violence than they are catching coronavirus in the middle of a global pandemic. And that really was the state of our community, really living with a lot of anxiety and fear around being attacked. 75%, so Napoth also conducted a poll of the largest poll ever of Asian American Pacific Islander women voters right after the elections in 2020. 75% of the people we polled said they have experienced some kind of racism in the last 24 months. And so this is obviously a huge issue that we are now dealing with, or have been dealing with, but now more coming to surface, and people are paying attention also because of the mass shootings in Atlanta of with the Asian American women being targets. Now more people are talking about it, but as you can see, over 24 months, that's even before the pandemic, Asian American women have been experiencing racial discrimination. Asian Americans are also least likely to send their kids back to school in person when things opened up and there was the option of going back hybrid or doing remote learning. Asian American families opted most likely to keep their kids home, and this was due to fear and concern of bullying that would happen at school. Whenever there's been a scapegoating of a racial group around a very broadly felt and experienced incident or experience, the studies have shown that children that look of that origin or of that background do get bullied at school. And one of the things that we have been really concerned about is lack of planning on schools' parts on how to address coronavirus related, not just the bullying for sure, but the stereotypes that are related. So for example, I was talking to a friend who has a 10-year-old daughter who she sent back to school in person. And she told me that they were playing something called the coronavirus tag at school, right? No one is reporting this because there's no kid crying, no one is being bullied, but this is becoming part of what, and coronavirus tag. And the way the game goes is that the Chinese kids have to be it, right? Like they're the ones who have to chase other kids. And they, she said it kind of matter-of-factly to her mom. And it's so concerning to adults who, are trying to protect our children, and yet is showing up in such mundane ways, and schools are not addressing it at all. And so this is a huge concern for many of us that are getting ready to send our kids back to school this fall. And just to wrap up, wage gap is a huge issue in our community as well. So, while we say the average is, Asian American Pacific Islander women make 85 cents to a white man's dollar. When you disaggregate the data, Bhutanese American women make 38 cents to a white man's dollar. That's half of what our racial group is said to be making, right? So the disparity is huge, and so we need to pay attention to ethnic specific groups as well and their data. And lastly, gender-based violence also plays a huge role in keeping Asian American women in poverty. 56% of Filipinas and 64% of Indian and Pakistani women have reported experiencing intimate partner violence. Many Asian American Pacific Islander women come to the United States dependent on their spouse for their status. And so that makes them vulnerable as well, right? Both that they cannot work, and so financially dependent, but also because their legal status in the United States dependent on their spouse. So often they don't leave So those are really common ways that Asian American Pacific Islander women are kept in poverty and in abusive situations. And so we need to really advocate for really improving our immigration policies, especially in addressing vulnerable populations. And this data comes from an organization called Asian Pacific Islander Gender-Based Violence, API-GVB. They are a national organization that focuses specifically on advocacy for our community around gender-based violence. And so as you can see, there are a lot of intersecting issues that impact our community. There's not just one thing that we can address and wave a magic wand on to help Asian American Pacific Islander come out of poverty. And so the work that we have to do is intersectional and multi-issue. I'm not an immigrant on Monday and a worker on Tuesday and a mom on a Wednesday. I'm all of those things every day of the week. And so we need to find ways to address solutions that address the holistic nature of who we are and the challenges that we face in those intersections every day. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Reverend Choimoro. So much there that you put out for consideration. And I feel awful because I would love an opportunity to just kind of dig deeper inside of what you offered, as well as what Dr. Falcone have shared with us today. So thank you to you both. There are some questions that have emerged in the chat, and we will see if there is an opportunity to explore those as we're looking at those in the chat. So, we've entertained this whole notion of care and the genderization, the racialization of care, and how it's really been, for it to be something so important, has been marginalized, and ways for us to kind of reframe that. And then thinking about what was just shared around just like all of the research and the data, and how so important it is for us to look closely, sort of really lean into that disaggregation of the data, and really asking those important questions around why some of the disparities exist. And it was also said earlier that when we're talking about all of the issues or any of the issues, we're really talking about women's issues and gender issues, because everything touches us. And, or as you just put it, you're a whole person, everything intersects together. And so, there's just so much for us to be mindful of. And I argue that as we give care to attending to the perspectives and needs of women in our society, particularly women of color, and other dimensions of our gender. So if we intersect that even further, across the gender spectrum, as we care for the unique aspects of our needs, at the end of the day, we actually end up caring for everybody's needs. So this conversation is just so important, because there's no win-lose in doing so. When we listen to these voices and these perspectives and these needs and attend to them, we are caring for all of humanity. And so with that said, let's see, questions that have emerged that we want to dive into. Let's see, there's quite a bit that is here. I'm trying to figure out. Let's see. Here's one, which I think it may speak directly to you, Reverend Choimoro. This person says, I work in a large rural area in Texas. We have a diverse group of Asian Americans here. However, they are underserved because of the reluctance or fear of seeking services. Do you have any advice for engagement or outreach?
Yeah, sure. So, I think Asian Americans, very much like other people, trust people who look and sound like them. And so I think it's really important that you're able to find folks who can kind of be, what I call bridge leaders, right? Like they are from the community, but understand the importance of the services that your organization offers. Because even if they all speak English, they're not likely to trust people they perceive to be outsiders or don't know. I will also say that a lot of misinformation and the fear around public charge that was generated by the Trump administration is a reality. There are many Asian Americans who have, kind of already decided that, been told also falsely, right, that they shouldn't access public aid and services. And then they can't differentiate between like public-based, government-based services versus, nonprofits, private services. And so they just generally don't want any help because they're very concerned about it impacting their immigration status or, when they file for green card or citizenship. So that is something that we have been working really hard to correct, and especially with the ruling that, that can not be the case, right? Like we've really been trying to educate our community, but there's been a lot of misinformation and fear based on the misinformation that's out there. But I would say number one thing to do is really finding people who are seen as trusted members, even if they're not in the community, but like people in the community that in the general broader community that people trust. I think that's really it. And I think the other piece is, what you perceive to be something that they're lacking, they might not even know or understand. And so some of it is education. And I think, as somebody who's immigrated here, I've learned that there's often this assumption that like everybody understands the welfare system and all of these services and child care system, all of these things, and that it's just a matter of asking for it, because if you have the need, you will come ask. And often people don't even know that those are things that they have benefit, that they could benefit from. So the knowledge gap is really big. And I would say, at minimum, I'm not sure what the demographic is, but if the majority of them are immigrant generation and they don't speak English, you need to at least have language access, not like just Google Translate your stuff, but like actually have somebody who knows that community, because also they might not be very literate in their own language. And so we often say like, you need to translate everything to about third grade reading level of their language, right? Because Google Translate will translate it into fancy Korean, and I sometimes don't even know what it's saying, right? So you need to be really mindful of and understand the community that you're working with in order for them to feel like you're somebody they can trust and rely on to get the services from.
Thank you for that. And so again, I think there was a thing that you had surfaced earlier that you just surfaced in that response you just shared, and it has to do with, this whole notion of access and engaging in strategies that sort of bridge or, build access to not only ensure that persons are able to, access what they need, but that, ultimately that builds our understanding of belonging and resilience. So with that said, Dr. Falcone, there was a question that came into the chat. You've probably seen it related to the concept of care. And we're wondering if you could speak to that, a little bit more, in particular, describe or provide an example of what that ideal relationship might look like.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think this is so important, and I think we've already seen some of the themes kind of emerging from Reverend Choimoro's response to the previous question, right? It's about who is centered in the decision-making processes that then shape the solutions for a particular problem you're addressing. Angela Davis talks about, if those who are most directly impacted by the issue are not the ones at the table deciding what those solutions look like, we're doing it wrong. And so a feminist ethic of care really requires us to do that harder work of engaging the communities most directly impacted by these issues. And so that means, and these are things that you might already be doing and might not be thinking about them in this way, but I know that you all need to do a community needs assessment. And so what are the ways that you can infuse some of these frames into that needs assessment and the process through which you do that community needs assessment? It's really about power sharing and thinking through your service delivery model. Is it always a transactional service delivery model, right? Sometimes that might be the solution, right? If we think about the possibility for community community action to serve as a mutual aid redistributing of resources, that is like the community says, this is what I need, and community action addresses that need in a transactional way, right? Like that is still good care work because you've decided collectively that that's the best solution for that particular issue. But if instead you're not having that direct communication with folks who are directly impacted by these issues, right? What tends to happen is we develop service delivery models that are about, more about the ease of the people delivering service versus the people who need the services. And so that is really where I would encourage you to think about, how do you operationalize this, right? I'm asking the large questions for you all to do that really difficult work. Like I don't envy the work that you have ahead of you, but I think if you really kind of reframe and create an opportunity for care to be a central value, which it already is embedded in the work of community action, like how then can you make sure that you're taking care and that people receiving care when they come to your services are getting it in a way that works for everybody?
Thank you so much for that response. Very important, very helpful. We have approached the top of the hour. What do you know? Talking about very important stuff and time just gets away. And so I do feel like, I want to talk more about this, but, we all have things to move on to, but may we all be centered, in the wisdom that was shared with us today. And, as we engage in the practice and action of care, may we do so, with the what is it, the unique perspectives, needs, opportunities, challenges, all the things in mind, particularly as it relates to diverse women in our society, and persons of diverse genders, understanding that we all have value, are important, and we are all human beings, and really not only deserve, but I don't even like that word deserve, but in essence, the promise that we put out earlier in our conversation around, caring about the entire community from the community action perspective, we really believe in the promise that everyone should have access to the opportunity for success. And when we do so, related to women, it's by default, it really involves and includes all of us. And so there are lots of resources that have been shared in the chat by Reverend Choimoro through her organization. Additionally, Dr. Falcone will share the PDF of her slides, and so we'll share those with our participants from today. Additionally, if you all didn't have an opportunity to participate in the Equity Summit that occurred in April, all of the resources and many of the presentations that were offered at that time are still available for access. So we invite you all to check those out. Also, please give us your feedback to let us know how today's presentation went. Our hope is that we will create some more space, more expanded, deeper space for conversations such as this, because everything, again, that has been offered has just been so critical and important. I will make a plug for something that is critical or important in terms of the well-being, particularly for women, children, and families. There is the child tax credit that has been made available through our administration, the child tax credit program. And so for those of you who are not aware of that, please share that information to your customers. Again, it's an opportunity for more families, for more women to be able to tap into needed resources for the well-being and mobility of their families. And we, in our observation, have seen that because of the way the system is set up, it has created some barriers to access. And so, for those who are needing support in terms of making the information more accessible to your people so that they can tap into this important resource, we're here for you. Persons do not have to have filed their taxes in order to sign up for this important benefit. And so again, we thank you all for joining us today. If you haven't signed up to attend the Partnership's annual convention in Boston, it is scheduled to take place September 1st through the 3rd of this year. Please join us. Again, we thank you so much, Reverend Choimoro, as well as Dr. Falcone. You are just wonderful people, and we are grateful for what you've shared. Everybody, thank you again for joining us, and make it a great day. This ends our webinar today. Take care now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.